Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this event. This is the first of what I hope may be other events organized by RDFRS, whose banner you see up there. I'm delighted to be able to say that we have finally, after I think a year and a half, managed to get charitable status, both in Britain and in America. The lawyers told me that they have never had such trouble. Even then, we had to tone down, clean up our act on our website no end, so that the second of those two websites is the one we had to remove from the foundation one. There, so the foundation website has all the things that it's respectable. The real stuff is in the It's very kind of Andy Thomson, Professor J. Anderson Thomson, to give this talk today. I asked him how he wished to be described, and he said, as a former redneck and shrink. He is in fact a practicing psychiatrist and an academic psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, which is a university that I hope to have some association with in the future. He's made a special study of suicide, religious terrorism. He comes to psychiatry with an interest in evolutionary psychology and evolutionary psychiatry, and he brings these insights to this vexed question of suicide terrorism. Andy Thomson. Is it we few, we happy? We few, we happy few, we band of brothers.
Last Saturday, Mahed Ashur, a 23-year-old young man from Nablus, was arrested in Tel Aviv. He had managed to get there with an explosive suicide vest. He was allegedly planning on creating havoc on Yom Kippur. On Monday, in Bakuba, in Iraq, a young man in a mosque blew himself up, killed 28 people, wounded 38 others. On Tuesday, near a dam near Lake Tartar, near Baghdad, 2 Afghanis in 2 trucks were stopped before they could commit a suicide terrorist act intended to flood areas around Baghdad. Also on Tuesday, a suicide car bomber killed 3 in Basra. In Afghanistan, a suicide motorcyclist attacked a convoy of Afghani police and killed 5. On Wednesday, there were 3 suicide terrorist attacks in Iraq. In Sinjar, a sheikh who had spoken out against al-Qaeda was killed with his son and 10 others. There were 2 suicide attacks in Mosul that day, one against a court building that was being constructed, another against a police convoy. I don't know yet what happened on Thursday. In all likelihood, there were suicide attacks. And as we speak here today, somewhere in the world, a young man or young men are going through the rituals of their religion, preparing for death. They will don an explosive vest or get into a bomb-laden truck or car, kill themselves and numerous others. How do we understand this? They are probably well-educated, mentally healthy, morally driven. In the unlikely event that it is a woman, she is probably depressed and facing extreme social rejection in her milieu. How do we understand their motivations? Do you have an understanding of it? Now, certainly, how many of you knew about those suicide attacks that I just listed this week, every day this week? Okay. Few of us, because realistically, it's in a place far away, out of sight, out of mind. So let's bring it a little bit closer. How many of you came to this conference by plane? Okay. On September 5th, 8 individuals were arrested in Denmark, 3 in Germany. The allegations against the 3 in Germany were that they were going to conduct suicide terrorist attacks against Ramstead Air Force Base, but also against the Frankfurt Airport. How many of you have been through the Glasgow airport? Okay. In June, 2 men crashed a Jeep loaded with explosives into Terminal 1. Fortunately, the bombs didn't go off. They got out of the car. One of the men doused himself in gasoline, lit himself on fire, and screaming Allah Akbar. Both men tried to fight off the people that were trying to grab them. Kafil Ahmed was the young man who soaked himself in gasoline and ignited himself. Okay. 33 days later, he died, never having gained consciousness. His entire body was burned, with one exception, his genitals. The irony here is that suicide bombers, young men, have been stopped, okay, and their genitals are wrapped in tissue paper or towels, trying to protect them for the virgins in paradise. As Sam Harris has said, these people believe this. Okay. What do we know about Ahmed? A brilliant student, healthy, his life ahead of him. How did this happen? His accomplice was a physician, and I think when he goes on trial, we'll learn more. What I would like to do this morning is 2 things. One, to give you a brief history of suicide terrorism, to ground you in the history. And then second, and more importantly, to give you a formulation, a 3-pronged formulation for your consideration, so that when you hear about these, you'll, I think, have some idea of the psychology behind it. But before I start the main part of my talk, I want to thank Richard Dawkins for all of his work, for the foundation, for the opportunity to present here today, for his courage. Thank you, Richard. When you know about these people and what they can do, it is very sobering when men like Richard and Sam Harris, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Christopher Hitchens, when they speak out. They are literally putting their lives on the line, and I think we all owe them enormous gratitude. I would also like to thank the foundation, and particularly this gentleman over here, Josh Timonen, who has created, I think, one of the most outstanding websites there are. And the reaches. I also would like to thank, if Margaret's here, for organizing this meeting of AAI. And I'd also like to thank the staff of the Richard Dawkins Foundation for all their work. Okay. Let's get started. The ironies in the history abound. The original suicide terrorists were the Jewish zealots, the Sicarii, at the time of the Roman occupation, the 1st century AD. And it was the Jewish zealots, the Sicarii, that led to 2 uprisings, the destruction of the temple, and really, in a sense, came to an end at Masada. Fast forward 10 centuries, the Islamic Order of Assassins, the Hashashin, in northwest Iran, Shiites attacking Sunni. Okay, skip forward 10 more centuries, the kamikazes. It started in December of 1944. At the Battle of Okinawa in April of 1945, 2,000 kamikaze, thinking their emperor was God, recruited by Shinto and Buddhist priests, 2,000 kamikaze pilots attacked 300 U.S. warships, 5,000 U.S. military personnel were killed. It was something that contributed quite heavily to the decision to use the atomic bomb. Modern suicide terrorism begins possibly in 1981. Ironically, the bombing of the Iraqi embassy in Beirut, possibly ordered by Khomeini, we're not sure, but it might have been a suicide bombing. Certainly, there's no question, but what most scholars will agree on is that Hezbollah in Lebanon in 1982, the attack on Israeli barracks was probably the first. We're more familiar with it with the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in April of 1982, and then, of course, the attack on the Marine barracks. And here we know the identity of the suicide terrorists. And as you can see, 2 young men in their 20s. Anybody, if Wolfowitz had known history, the idea that U.S. troops would occupy Iraq and be met with roses is simply so wrong, it's not even wrong. 1987, with a model bombing, exactly like the Marine barracks in Hezbollah, probably trained by Hezbollah, the Tamil Tigers begin their suicide campaign. They're best known for using numerous women. Approximately 30% of their suicide terrorists are women. Their campaign has gone on uninterrupted for 20 years. This young woman died about a year ago this month. 1994, Hamas begins their suicide campaign in Israel. 1996, the Kurdish Workers' Party in Turkey. We have the first, at least known and recorded, woman suicide bomber who was pregnant at the time of her attack. And then, of course, Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda begins in 1998. They may have attempted some in 97, but in 98, the attacks on the embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. And then, of course, September 11th. The biggest suicide attack in modern suicide terrorism history. Remember, Okinawa was 5,000. Okay. Now, there was a physician who, by all accounts, was at one time in his life a very good physician, used to putting bodies together, not tearing them asunder, and he had this to say about 9/11. This was his formulation. Is there anybody here that would agree with that? Unlikely. Anyone know who that physician is? Absolutely. Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, number 2 of Al-Qaeda. And then, of course, in 2000, the Chechnyans begin their campaign, the worst, of course, being the Beslan school massacre in September of 2004. And everything since then has been, in a sense, an extension of the Middle East bombings, largely, the vast majority. Clearly, the Tamil Tigers continue. This is 7/7 in London. Afghanistan suicide bombing has literally exploded. As you can see, the statistic, for those in the back who might not be able to read this, already this year, almost 200 suicide attacks. But the main victims of suicide bombing by Muslims are other Muslims. And this just gives you, again, some numbers. This is annual rates global. This is the whole world, 80 to 90, 4.7 a year, then 90 to 2000, 16 per year. Then just the first 5 years of this decade, 180 per year. But you'll notice when you break down this decade, it is exploding. And this is just up through 2005. It's hard to find the statistics for 2006, 2007, but they're even greater. It's 1 or 2 a day in Iraq. And again, that's where it's occurring at its worst. 50% of the young men from Saudi Arabia. You remember the first suicide attack in Iraq was against the UN headquarters there in the summer of 2003. And you can see the escalation. Now, those are killed and wounded civilians. That includes all. But many of those individuals are victims of suicide terrorist attacks. And I think this just sums it up. It has now far exceeded anything in history. Okay. So, how do we understand it? I want to now move into the heart of the talk, which is a 3-pronged formulation of suicide terrorism, which I give for your consideration. The first prong, male-bonded coalitionary violence with lethal raiding against innocents is as old as our species. It is even older. And This capacity is embedded in all men. Every man in this room has that capacity. The women are off the hook on this one. The second is that the capacity for suicide resides in all of us, men and women. It's an evolved capacity that can be triggered in certain circumstances. And there are really two kinds. One that I'll refer to as burdensomeness, and this seems to animate the women suicide bombers. And the second, retaliation bargaining, which is the motive for male suicide bombers. Then the third prong of the formulation, that religion is a cultural construct, a product of human minds, and that the cognitive mechanisms that make us all vulnerable to religious belief can be easily exploited. And this is what makes religious ideology the most potent ideology for hijacking these capacities for male-bonded violence and suicide. What's the evidence? These are the Yanomamo warriors of South America. The reason these men are important is that this is a window into deep time, into deep history, the time before history, the environment that we evolved in. Up until the year 1500, 2/3 of the world, still small hunter-gatherer populations. This is the context in which our psychological capacities evolved. You have to deal with certain myths first. The idea that peaceful societies were common, sort of the noble savage, and that violent conflicts were infrequent, combat was limited, it's just a product of capitalism and patriarchy in the modern world. Because the reality is that war is universal and common. The hunter-gatherers, the environment that we evolved in, ruthlessly violent. What do I mean by lethal raids? Parties of allied men collectively seek out a vulnerable neighbor, assess the probability of success, and conduct a surprise attack. Again, if you look at pre-literate societies, 20 to 40% of the men die at the hands of other men in lethal raids. In hunter-gatherer societies, it's about 0.5% of the population per year. So if you took the population of the world in the 20th century and they were all hunter-gatherers, we were all hunter-gatherers, it'd be about 2 billion war deaths in the 20th century. Everybody thinks of the 20th century as murderous. It was. About 500 million people killed in wars. But that gives you some comparison. Again, this capacity is not uniquely human. It occurs in other species. It is favored by natural selection. It is continuous in warfare in human and pre-human history. This capacity for lethal raiding, I will submit to you, arose, in our common ancestor, before the split with chimpanzees, in our common ancestor, is at least 5 to 7 million years old. Now, what is the evidence for this? And I'm quickly going to go through 3 layers of evidence: the comparative evidence, the paleontologic evidence, and the cross-cultural evidence. In January of 1974, in Jane Goodall, in one of her chimpanzee areas, one of the field workers watched a group of males come together and with coordination, stealth, and surprise move to a neighboring community, find victims, and kill them. It was observed repeatedly. Think of the cognitive software to be able to do that without language, to come together with coordination, stealth, and surprise, and to kill. It's been observed numerous times since. This is a group of chimpanzees in Uganda moving out on a lethal raid. In chimpanzees, you do not see, in males, one-on-one killing. It is all male coalitionary violence with lethal raiding. You may not know it, but this is your family history. To the left here is earliest hominids. So at the bottom of the screen would be the common ancestor with chimpanzees, the chimpanzee bonobo line going off in another direction. Okay? So if you find lethal raiding in chimpanzees, lethal raiding throughout the hominid record, I think that's suggestive evidence that it was in our common ancestor. And I think this says it far better than I could, the communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. And what do we see in the fossil record? Over and over again, evidence of what is called conspecific violence, human-on-human violence. This is the bone bed in South Dakota, 500 men and children, no women of reproductive age, with clear forensic evidence of slaughter by other humans. One of the earliest graves of Homo sapiens in Egypt. You can't see it very well, but those pencils point to arrowheads. These men died by violence. And what you see throughout the fossil record, and I'm talking, Australopithecines, Homo erectus, all the way through the fossil record, are cranial wounds. Male skeletons predominate in these kind of injuries, and primarily left-sided wounds, which you would expect from a right-handed species. Okay. So there's the comparative evidence, the paleontologic evidence. What's the cross-cultural evidence? There, as I said, if you look at the existing pre-literate societies, the rates of violence in men, 20-40% of men die. One of the most interesting studies is of the Yanomamo by Napoleon Chagnon, where he showed that those men who killed Unicoi had more wives than those who had not killed, and even more, far more children. So here was an example in the present, in the 1960s, of killing having a significant reproductive advantage, Darwinian natural selection. That capacity becomes embedded, or at this point, obviously reinforced. And again, if you look at any suicide terrorist attack, it is a male-bonded coalition. Okay, this is Muhammad Atta, one of the pilots of 9/11. Ziad Jarrah, the pilot of the plane that crashed in Philadelphia, was taken down, Flight 93. The 4 London bombers of 7/7. The Lackawanna 6 of New York, who were fortunately caught before they could carry out any attack. If the men in this room will think about their childhoods, okay, all of us as boys begin to practice the techniques of primitive war, coming together and conducting a surprise attack. If you think about your boyhoods, how many of you can remember that? Certainly. Okay. This is a human universal. This is a human universal. These capacities, are in our bones, and we start practicing them when we're just boys. Okay. And if you think about it, I think the nicest summary of this psychology is actually Shakespeare. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For whosoever sheds his blood with me today shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. If you read that speech, that's the psychology of male-bonded coalitionary violence. Said better than I think anyone ever has. Okay, let's move to the second prong, suicidality. There's two kinds, I think, burdensomeness and retaliation bargaining. And there's a phenomenon in nature where animals will kill themselves. This is just one, the Australian social spider. The mother gives birth, then turns her body into food. About 100 offspring consume her postpartum. Okay. There's phenomena in nature of copulatory suicide. But this illustrates how the capacity for suicide can evolve in organisms, including us. It also, incidentally, is, I think, one of the best illustrations of Professor Dawkins' selfish gene theory, where natural selection operates not at the level of the individual, but at the fundamental unit of life, the gene. And sometimes there is conflict between genetic interest and self-interest. So you can see that this capacity can evolve and become embedded in organisms. The burdensomeness kind is referred to as negative inclusive fitness, described by De Cantanzaro. inclusive fitness are the copies of my genes in future generations. And this is the kind of suicide where an individual feels burdensome. Clinically, the individual feels burdensome. You don't get a warning about these kind of suicides. Suicide is an end in itself. The initial attempt is usually effective, and kin are often relieved. Okay. And if I'm a burden and I kill myself, and I've got 3 children, that's a net increase in genetic interest 50%. Okay. Clinically, these are usually older men who are failing, they give you no warning, they kill themselves. Okay. Interestingly, in the political arena, it seems to be reversed, and this characterizes female suicide bombers. This is Danu, the woman on the far left. She was 35 years of age. She had been the victim of gang rape in her society. She was therefore unmarriageable. She had no children, unmarried, unmarriageable. And she was the Tamil tigress who assassinated Premier Gandhi. This is the back of her head here, and you can see Premier Gandhi. She wore a suicide belt, appeared pregnant, came down, kneeled in front of him, and exploded her suicide vest, killed him and I think 14 others. But, it's a tragic history. Where we know the details of women suicide bombers, this is what you see. The average age is in their 20s, usually some kind of personal loss, but within their societies, they usually face some form of extreme social rejection. They've been the victim of sexual violence. Many of the women are rape victims. Of the Tamil tigers, raped by Sinhalese and Indian troops, so they're unmarriageable. Extramarital affairs, and families come to them, brothers, fathers, uncles, and say, you either kill yourself or we'll kill you. Divorce, infertility. Within their societies, this is usually the case, and they are depressed. And again, wherever you know the history, this is what you will find. This is Wafa Idris. On January 27, 2002, Yasser Arafat made an open appeal for women suicide bombers. It is on videotape. That night, Wafa Idris killed herself. She killed one other person and wounded about 140. What's her history? Age 16, she's married to a man 10 years older. She has a miscarriage shortly thereafter, goes into a profound postpartum depression. Turns out the miscarriage left her infertile. Her husband leaves her with the support of his family. She is living at home. She is a burden, feels like a burden. This is Wafa Idris and her mother. The first Hamas woman suicide bomber, Reed Riasha, forced to kill herself by her husband and her lover. This is Raid with her child. The black widows of Chechnya, not a whole lot of them are actually widows. They usually are people in their family have been killed. These are the Nagayev sisters. Amanta was one of the suicide bombers that took down one of the planes in August. Her sister blew herself up at a Moscow subway station. They were both infertile. Husbands had left them because of it. Their brother had been killed. The women who did the suicide bombing at the rock concert in Moscow, again, tragic histories. One of the Chechnyan bombers, her bomb didn't go off, or she couldn't get it to go off. We know a lot about her. Musa Koyova, kidnapped, raped, forced into a second marriage with an older guy who's killed. His family takes their child, a horrendous history. This is the woman who, you remember, tried to blow herself up at that wedding in Amman, Jordan. Again, 35 years old, unmarried, no children, 3 of her brothers killed. This is the first woman, European convert to Islam, who was a suicide bomber. History of depression, substance abuse, probable infertility. Okay, but again, if you look at the women, let's see. If you look at the women, this is the history, the burdensome type of suicidality. Okay, what about the men? I want to put a cartoon in here which actually illustrates the dynamics. For those of you who can't read the caption, it says, they're going to print a retraction. Your deserts are not inconsistent. Okay? So this chef is standing on a ledge, threatening suicide. She's up against a more powerful other, the New York Times maybe, and she's openly threatening suicide, trying to force a change. And this is the nature of retaliation bargaining. And if you stop and think about it, Gandhi's fast to the death, trying to force change in the British Empire. Bobby Sands, you know, the suicide hunger strike, trying to force a change in Margaret Thatcher. Okay. And retaliation bargaining, this is when an individual is helpless and powerless, and that the suicidality becomes an alternative strategy trying to compel change in another individual. Clinically, you see this, patient of mine, man breaks up with her, she takes an overdose trying to get him to come back. She calls him and tells him that she's taken the overdose. Okay, it's an open communication of suicidality, trying to communicate, force a change. And this is what we see in the male suicide bombers. These are the young men of 9/11. And again, you would be hard-pressed to find any psychopathology in any of them. Again, these men are well-educated, mentally healthy, morally driven. The only one that was married was Ziad Jarrah, the pilot of the Pennsylvania plane. If you knew him, you'd want your daughter to marry him. Lovely guy. Raed Malik, one of the Hamas bus bombers with his 2 children. These are cousins. The one on the far side, the smaller one was the recruiter. The taller one was recruited and killed himself in Palestine. These are the London bombers, 3 on the subway, 1 on the bus. Again, one of them married. Again, relatively well educated. You couldn't find any psychopathology. And there's series after series. This is just one. Nisra Hassan, who's interviewed about 250 families of completed suicide bombers or the ones who didn't succeed. And this is what you see. You know, there's no psychopathology. This is Zacharias Moussaoui. This is the closest I've come to it. I had the privilege of working with the Federal Public Defender's Office on his case. He's the 20th hijacker, you remember, who wasn't included. And why? Because he was unstable. His comrades in Chechnya saw him as unstable, and so he was probably not included in 9/11 because he was unstable. And if you think about it, such a complicated mission is going to require stability, intelligence, and intelligence, and education. What's the training? Focus on family humiliation, brothers sacrificing for each other, lures of paradise. And it's not just the virgins. If you are a martyr, you get to bring 70-some of your family. They get a direct pass to paradise. Living martyr final testaments. This also hijacks one of our capacities is when, if I say in my head, promise you I'm going to do something, that's one thing. But if I make a public promise, I'm more likely to do it. A public promise commits us. And this is what has led to the living martyr videos. It really commits the individual. They're more likely to go through with it. This is Ada and Jarrah's martyrs video. Notice the date, January of 2000, 18 months before 9/11. But this is their martyrs video. Now, the ones that I think realistically we're concerned about in the West are the terrorists that are coming from Europe, the United States even, who are in the West, outside of the Middle East. And what do we see? These men, again, culturally dislocated, educated, they become embedded in an idea of seeing themselves as a vanguard of a new Islamic order, drawn into the cult of martyrdom. They come to believe in a prophetic role in their parents' home country. The idea is that they're going to recover the dignity that has been lost. Generally, they are employed below the level of their education. Tremendous guilt about the failures of their home country. In some sense, tempted by the West and tortured by that temptation. If you're interested in a good essay, this is in the New York Review of Books, Carroll, September of 2005. Superb essay. If you're interested in a movie form, there are 2 outstanding movies that portray the psychology of suicide bombing. Paradise Now, which was made in Palestine by Palestinians, also the subplot in the well-known movie Syriana. Excellent portrayals of the psychology of male suicide bombing. One of the other things is that all of these interviews, these men are deeply religious, either from childhood, or if they weren't in childhood, they become, while in Europe, become deeply religious. Okay, let's turn to the third prong. This, I promise you, is not Daniel Dennett in disguise. I thought you would like that, Dan. But it's not Daniel Dennett. He's back here, if you'll raise his hands. Daniel, thank you. But this is a way to bring in how to understand religion. The way Daniel opens his wonderful book, Breaking the Spell, the suicidal ant. The ant that crawls up to the top of the blade of grass where he or she is eaten. Why would that evolve? Doesn't have that much to do with the ant. It has to do with a parasite, the lance fluke, which hijacks its brain. Okay? And I think that's the way you want to think about religion, is these religions are carefully structured that they hijack human brains. And how can they hijack human brains? Because they hijack cognitive mechanisms which make us all vulnerable to religious beliefs. And that all religious ideas are just, I think the evidence is there, byproducts of cognitive mechanisms designed for other purposes. Everyday, ordinary mechanisms that help us survive but can come together, create these supernatural, minimally counterintuitive worlds and become attention-grabbing. And I'm sure most of the people in this audience are familiar with these books, but these outline the byproduct theory of religion. And again, I think if you look at suicide terrorism, the byproduct theory both helps explain it, but I think the byproduct theory is also a piece of evidence for it. Okay. Now, I want to take you through just some of these cognitive mechanisms to show you, and I'm going to focus on the ones that are involved in suicide terrorism. The first is decoupled cognition. Fancy word for the following. How many of you, as you've been sitting here listening to me, have thought about a conversation you had some days past, or have thought about a conversation you might have later today or this evening? Of course. It's an extraordinary capacity. It's an extraordinary capacity. You can, it's crucial to memory, it's crucial to planning, but you can have detailed conversations in your head, detailed relationships with unseen others. Okay. And as you can see, it's just one step to ancestor worship, interacting with a god. But something that's absolutely crucial and to our humanness, easily hijacked. Reciprocal altruism. All of us have dedicated cognitive software for reciprocity. We keep track of who we owe and what we owe. And what is prayer? Prayer is basically an explicit appeal for reciprocity. Childhood credulity. As Richard has said, natural selection has designed childhood brains to soak up the culture around them. It's crucial, particularly when it comes from a voice of authority. We all are much more deferential to authority than any of us would like to believe. That's the meaning of Stanley Milgram's famous experiments. Okay? So we are all, as children, very vulnerable to authority, but even as adults, we are very, very vulnerable to authority. Religion hijacks that. But those are crucial survival mechanisms, too. The attachment system. John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, the basic caretaking system, mother and infant. Okay? When we're distressed, we turn to a caretaker. What happens in religion? We turn to a caretaker, a supernormal parent. Look at Robin Dunbar's recent article in Science. They speculate that attachment system, that dyadic attachment system, is the foundation for all human relationships. Not just caretaking or romantic love, but all human relationships. Also, romantic love. We all have dedicated systems in our brain that for us to fall in love and commit to somebody. Mother Teresa, when she became a nun, wrote to a friend that she was happy she was now the bride of Christ. How many of you have seen the movie Painted Veil? Okay? The Diana Rigg character, the nun, that speech she gives where she talks about as a young girl, she fell in love with Jesus. Okay? And again, those systems are hijacked by religion. And in suicide terrorism, the suicide martyrs become married when they kill themselves, the jihadists. That's how it's referred to. Not just the virgins in paradise, but the act of martyrdom is that they become married. What is called the problem of dead bodies. Okay? We all have cognitive software that we take for granted, which gives us the idea, the ability. We know that other people have minds like ours, with wishes, desires, memories. These are theory of mind capacities. Their absence is autism, but we take it for granted. But we know others, and we read eye gaze a lot to get those wishes and thoughts. But those mechanisms don't turn off. They persist. But then we also have mechanisms that are called natural kind modules that help us distinguish living from dead. So when there's a dead body, part of us knows they're dead, but our mind's saying that mind is still alive. You know, and that particularly after someone dies, we're still talking to them. Okay? And religions obviously hijack this. Doesn't take much to go to the idea of souls, souls in heaven, souls in paradise. Okay. Coalitionary psychology, all of us know who our friends and enemies are. We have evolved cognitive software for that. A naive sociology, all of us have difficulty distinguishing groups as groups of individuals. Okay? We're very prone to say, you know, French are rude or something like that. And I could take this room. This is an ancient social psychology experiment. We could take this room, randomly divide you into two groups, give each group a task. Within an hour and a half, you would think your group was much better than those poor idiots on the other side. Okay? It's a vulnerability we all have. Okay? And obviously religions take advantage of this. Okay? You know, the out group. You know, we very easily break down into us, them. Related to this is that unfortunately, the same cognitive mechanisms we use to distinguish prey animals are what we use to think about outgroups. Okay? Martin Luther, what did he say about the Jews? They were worms. Okay? We tend to think about outgroups as, you know, as prey animals. Then, of course, hard to fake signals of commitment, hard to fake honest signals of commitment, and religions are huge in this. And I recommend to you the work of Richard Sosis, who's looked at this. And this is crucial to religions. Now, when you look at a picture of this man, I think most of you recognize him as the Dalai Lama. What do you think? What do you feel? I mean, check your guts for a minute and just see what you feel. I feel like, this guy's a kindly older brother. Okay? It mobilizes what are called transference feelings, something that Freud discovered. And it is that we base present relationships on past relationships. It's crucial. If we didn't, we'd have to learn about relationships each new time. Remember the movie Memento, the poor guy that he had to learn about relationships with each new one? Okay. Transference relationships, again, are ubiquitous. They're crucial. You know, we absolutely depend on them. Okay? You can see how religions hijack those. Okay? And the various transferences we can mobilize to religious figures. We all have moral feeling systems that are innate. Mark Hauser's recent work, highly recommend it. Again, showing that this is not something that religion gives us. This is something that we have on our own. Shows up very early in life. Altruistic punishment. We have evolved a capacity for this. What is altruistic punishment? All of us are willing to punish social cheaters at a cost to ourselves. And I think if any of us thinks about our history, we've all done this at some point. Somebody who's a social cheater, we will punish even if it costs us. Okay. Suicide terrorism, you can see, is really just an extreme on a continuum that's already there. And then the most powerful mechanism in suicide terrorism, kin psychology. All of us have mechanisms to identify and relate to kin and distinguish non-kin. You know, the Pope is the Holy Father. Priests are the brothers. Nuns are sisters. Think of all the way. You know, think about the Marines, your brothers. Kin psychology is very powerful. Think about, well, look at this for a second. This is a Hamas trainer. And I hope you can start to see the elements that are in this. We focus his attention on paradise, on being in the presence of Allah, an unseen other, meeting the Prophet Muhammad, interceding for his loved ones, getting those relatives into paradise, the houris, or the virgins. You start to see the elements embedded there. And again, getting back to kin psychology, it is crucial for religions to redirect loyalties. Okay, I will defend my kin far quicker than non-kin. So religions are very adept at redirecting loyalties. Think about Matthew, I think it's chapter 10. Jesus says, he that loveth father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. Your enemy is in your own house. All religions work to break down basic kin loyalties and create pseudo-fictive kin. And the brother terrorist, the new vanguard. And this is crucial both to generating religions and their effectiveness, but is also central to suicide terrorism. And that's why I chose Muhammad, this picture of Muhammad Atta and his sister. It is rare, very rare, that the families of these individuals know what they are doing, planning or until it is done. And you will see public statements by family that are not what they feel privately. And this is, you can see the statement of one mother of a suicide bomber. Can you all read it in the back? Okay. It's powerful. I would taken a cleaver, cut open my heart, stuffed him deep inside. Okay. Now, another thing is that most suicide bombers, there's a charismatic leader of some kind. And this comes back to another concept elaborated by Dan Dennett, the mere messenger strategy. If I were to stand here and tell you I'm a god, hopefully somebody would go out quietly and call the psychiatric acute service line. Okay, but if I tell you I'm just a humble messenger of God, that I'm Reverend Thomson, okay, you would start to, you would, even though this group would be biased against it, even though, okay, but you would grant me an authority that I don't deserve, okay? But this is what all religions use. And used car salesmen and mafia capos. But if you think about it, it's a brilliant strategy, okay? The Pope, what is he called? God's vicar on earth, okay? Somebody? I'm probably, I'm just an educated redneck and the pronunciation just, Okay, and who is the mere messenger that is still alive and plagues us to this day? Okay. There are many different social uses of religion, but clearly, in addition to breaking kin bonds, historically, it has facilitated terrorism and war. The cross accompanied the sword everywhere. Islam was brought by the sword. The conservative brand of Wahhabism that plagues us, brought by the sword in Saudi Arabia. And why? It empowers disenfranchised young men, minimizes the fear of death. This just gives you some idea of some of the mosques we know that have already been involved. The current phenomena of suicide bombing, the ideology of it, actually stems, it's really an Egyptian ideology. And it comes from this man, Syed Qutb, one of the Muslim brothers, and one of the founders, I think. He was so dangerous, Nasser had him executed. If you want to understand the psychology, the ideology of what's going on today, there is no better place than the book, The Looming Tower. The very first part of that book is a biography, a thorough biography of Syed Qutb. I recommend it to you. You will understand the ideology, okay? And Qutb is the one that came up with the theological justification for killing other Muslims. This is just one of his friendlier quotes. Can you all read it in the back?
Please read it.
Okay. There is only one place on earth which can be called the House of Islam, and it is that place where an Islamic state is established and the Shahira is the authority and God's laws are observed. The rest of the world is the house of war. And once you get below bin Laden, most of the leadership of al-Qaeda, the original leadership, was Egyptian. Ayman al-Zawahiri and most of the others. But if you want to understand the ideology, again, The Looming Tower, Lawrence Wright, extraordinary book, but particularly that first chapter. Okay. That brings me to the conclusion. Okay. The basic argument here is that if we want to understand suicide terrorism at a fundamental level, at its most basic level, then we have got to face the horrors, some of the horrors of our evolutionary history and the murderous legacy it has left in all men. And we have to acknowledge the capacity for suicide that resides in all of us, men and women. And most importantly, we have to face the fact that religion is a man-made phenomenon. A dangerous man-made phenomenon that because of its very design, it is the most powerful ideology that can hijack these capacities for lethal raiding, murder, and suicide. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Andy, thank you very much. If I may say so, a model of how to give a lecture. Any questions? Dan?
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you mentioned Syed Qutb at the end.
Did you say that, Dan?
Yeah.
Dan Dennett?
He was made in Nasser's prison. And we have a factory now in Guantanamo that is making hundreds of his successors. And one of the most depressing thoughts to me is that I cannot yet imagine a future for those people other than death that is going to prevent that. And this is going to be one of the great stains, I think, on not just on America, but also one of the great dangers that we have created in the world.
Yes, thank you. Just one additional point. Syed Qutb's brother, who survived, was one of bin Laden's teachers. Zawahiri's uncle, Ayman al-Zawahiri's uncle, who was really, in effect, his father figure, was Syed Qutb's lawyer and principal disciple. There's a direct connection. And one of the points that Wright makes in his book is exactly what Dan said. This all grew in Egyptian prisons. I think there was a question there.
Since man is genetically predisposed to this type of behavior, as humans, what can we do to temper it?
I'm not. The question is, since we are predisposed towards this behavior, what can we do to temper it? I think that is the task of all of us. I think education, honesty, good leadership. A little point that I think is nice to illustrate this. I had the privilege last night of talking with Ayan Hirsi Ali, and I asked her what allowed her to do what she did. It was so extraordinary. She said it was, to a large extent, it was education. It was when she was growing up, her mother didn't allow televisions, and so they were bored, and so she read, and it was education. She thought that was one of the crucial factors. And just to illustrate how human this is, for those of you who have read her book, if you remember, page 76, she came perilously close to dying of a suicide attempt. And if you read the description of her suicide, It is really a combination of both the kinds that I just outlined for you today. She felt in terrible pain and a burden to her family, and she was deeply frustrated with her mother. It's a very poignant description of what I'm describing today, and happened in a very human individual who mercifully survived and now I think illuminates our world.
Do you have any doubt about the certitude of it being evolutionary? We've had an 800-year history in Ireland, intense adversity. I'm not aware of any suicide killings. Is that an exception?
I don't know Irish history, so I would defer to someone who does. One of the arguments here is that a lot of combat situations are essentially suicidal. That I think 9 out of 10 who have earned the Victoria Cross, it's awarded posthumously. But I don't think that's quite correct, because a lot of men go into battle still with the hope that they'll survive. But if anybody knows Irish history, I don't know.
I can offer a small answer to that. The IRA, the Irish Republican Army, are made up of Catholics, and one of the worst things that you can do as a Catholic is to commit suicide. And there's no exception for that if you happen to kill some of the bad guys while you're doing it.
For those of you who didn't hear, the answer was most of the IRA are Catholics. There's a strong prohibition against suicide in Catholicism, and it's an absolute prohibition. Yeah. There's no, you're not off the hook, which you are in Islam.
Catholics can do anything, of course, because you can ask for, you can confess the next day, but if you commit suicide, you're dead.
For those who didn't hear in the back, she says Catholics can confess anything they do, and so if they do something terrible, the next day they can confess it and it's okay. And if you commit suicide, you can't confess the next day. I'm not keeping track of, I think the gentleman back here had it, and then this one. Thank you.
My question is this. You mentioned that Iraq has seen more suicide bombings than ever total in history before. And yet the people in Iraq today are no more religious than they were when Saddam was in power. To what extent is the occupation of Iraq responsible for this? And why did these fanatically religious people not suicide bomb against Saddam, since the majority of them opposed his rule? What's the other factor at work there?
Did everybody hear the question? Yeah, okay. I don't know. I think that's a very important question. I think Saddam ruled with an iron fist. It would have been hard. I don't. The other thing is that historically, suicide terrorism has occurred when there's foreign occupation. Where there's foreign occupation, there's tremendous military asymmetry. So one side who's foreign is occupying, the other side has no weapons, basically. And so that's a part of it. So you have the U.S. Army there with tremendous, weapons. And if you notice, Hezbollah has stopped suicide bombing now that they have rockets. I think it was here and then back there. Yes, sir.
That was my point. The question
Could you stand up so people could hear, please?
The question I was going to ask had to do with the fact that most of these suicide bombings occur in areas that are under occupation. And there have been a number of studies done on that most suicide bombings occur in those situations. So how important is that occupation to the occurrence of suicide bombing?
Historically, it's been one of the main things. The question was how important is the occupation, is the place being occupied. That has been almost, from the very beginning. The Roman occupiers of Judea, the Jewish zealots, the Sunni occupiers of northwest Iran, the Order of Assassins. The biggest, in modern suicide bombing history, of course, the Marine occupation of Beirut. And the other thing, too, you have to keep in mind is that suicide bombing usually works.
So the suicide bombing are a response to occupation,
Yes.
and then religion is used to support.
Yes. Yeah, religion seems to be, you go from, I would submit to you, you go from terrorist attacks, say maybe the IRA, terrorist attacks to suicide terrorist attacks when there's a religious element. That seems to be one of the things that pushes it over the edge to suicide. And once you have a suicide terrorist who doesn't have to consider escape plans, it becomes a much more dangerous weapon. You have an intelligently guided weapon where you don't have to worry about an escape route. I think there and then there. Yes, sir.
I have two somewhat related questions. The first of which has to do with your sense of coalitional warfare that takes place. According to what I've read, and please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, it seems as if for that to function, the theory of inclusive fitness, there has to be less than 100% perception of the likelihood of death to the individual. In the situation of suicide bombing, it would seem as if there is a clear premeditated intent to perish in the onslaught, and that obviously in that case it would fail to correspond with the notion that there's a sort of fog of war and indeterminate nature to it. Additionally, you were talking about the terrorists in the 9/11 attack as essentially healthy-minded. I don't know if you care to talk about the perception of religion itself as a dissociative psychopathology that is yet to be recognized.
Okay. The first, everybody hears question? Okay. The first question was, and interrupt me if I don't have it correct, please, that the idea of coalitionary warfare is based on the idea that you're going to survive. So with suicide attacks, how can you have coalitionary warfare when you know you're going to die? What has happened is that the mind has been hijacked and you are operating as if you're going to continue to live, you're going to live in paradise, and you're going to be able to bring your family with you. So I think that overrides the fear of death. The second thing, the question is, should we consider religion a dissociative delusional disorder? Is that? Delusional psychopathologic. Well, no. I think this is a serious question because I think what we would like to move to is where people are educated to understand that it's a vulnerability. That we're all vulnerable to these beliefs. So that I think my wish would be 50, 100 years from now, high school psychology textbooks have this sort of thing, and children learn that human minds are vulnerable to supernatural beliefs, and these are some of them. I think that's where I would come down, because there is a difference between something like a religious belief, which I think is obviously potentially dangerous, and someone who has, say, schizophrenia, which is, a terrible illness of the brain, and is different, I think.
Comment about the Saddam Hussein no suicide bombing situation. Isn't it the case that almost all suicide bombers are Sunni? Even, say, in Hezbollah-sponsored suicide attacks, don't they exploit suicide populations to a large extent? And secondly, what kind of commentary? And the most aggrieved people in Iraq under Hussein were Shia. So, the question, would you have any commentary about Scott Atran's position about Muslim suicide bombers? He would claim largely that paradise is irrelevant and that the most effective cause is grievance.
Everybody hear the questions? Everybody hear the question?
Not really.
Okay. Okay. And correct me, please, if I have it incorrect. But the first question was about Iraq and that most of the bombers are Sunni, including Hezbollah. Hezbollah was Shia. The original suicide bombings in 82, 83, those are Shia. And yes, the suicide bombers now in Iraq are primarily, almost exclusively Sunni against Shia. And again, I think right now the Sunnis have a more intense tradition arising out of Al-Qaeda. The Sunni, the Qutb ideology is primarily a Sunni ideology. And I know Dan's an Islamic scholar, so correct me, please, Dan, if I don't have this right. is primarily, the ideology, the modern ideology is now primarily Sunni, is Kitab. But that would be my my quick thought on it. The second question again? Was it? Oh, Scott Atran, yes. I know Scott Atran. I've talked with him at length about this. I disagree with him, and my position is that I agree with the early Scott Atran. If you look at a March 2003 article in Science, The Genesis of Suicide Terrorism, I think that's closer. I don't understand entirely why he's sort of shifted. He is one of the individuals who has interviewed a lot of these bombers. And I think, for reasons I don't understand, he minimizes the impact of religion now, which he didn't in 2003. And when you talk to him about the recent people he's interviewed, I still see it in what he tells me. And again, he's preoccupied with the idea that these are male coalitions that come together, and so I say, okay, I mean, there's your male coalitionary violence, but one of the things that is still a factor, an important factor, is religion. And he's more focused on market share. These kids have nothing else to do, coming together, trying to become famous. And he says they're trying to become famous like soccer stars. I think there's a difference between imitating Beckham and imitating El-Zarqawi. But if you're interested in this topic, there's no better article than Genesis of Suicide Terrorism, Scott Atran, Science, March of 2003. In the back.
Can you comment on the role of the many madrasas in this picture of promoting a fertile ground for the hijacking of these cognitive mechanisms?
The question is the role of madrasas in forming suicide bombers. Yes, it's terrible. And they've gone from 3,000 in Pakistan in the 1980s to 30,000 currently. They are funded primarily by money from Saudi Arabia. These young boys are kept all day just memorizing the Quran. They are deprived of an education which I think would liberate them. I'm sort of biased. I think Nicholas Humphrey has it right, that we ought to have in the UN Charter a fundamental human right that children be protected from religious indoctrination.
Since males seem to have evolved with more violence and bring more violence to our society, is a possible solution to move towards a matriarchal society?
Did everybody hear the question? Should we move towards a more matriarchal society because so much of this violence is embedded in men? And people sort of laugh, but I would like to see more women in positions of leadership. And
Margaret Thatcher.
Okay, but Miss Thatcher may have been an exception, but I I'm open to disagreeing, but I think, I'd like to try at least.
Are there examples in primitive societies where women are dominant, demonstrate more peaceful existence?
The question was, are there in primitive societies where women have more leadership? I don't know the anthropologic history, but I think there was somebody back there and then here. Yes, sir.
I'm Ilaya from India. My question is, religion is practiced as a hereditary property throughout the world. The Catholic children are Catholics, the Muslim children are Muslims, the Hindu children are Hindus, automatically without any consent of the children, despite the children's charter passed by the UN. So is there a way out from this crisis to see that children are not stamped as religious people as soon as they are born?
The question had to do with children being labeled at birth in India, and Huh? In the whole world, okay, in the whole, but I think you're in the whole world. I guess my answer is to come to Professor Dawkins' talk tonight. No, I'm serious. Yeah, yes. Oh, I'm sorry, you were first then.
When I was a girl, there were about 5 or 6 girls in our neighborhood, and we played warfare games up until we were about 12, and then we played Let's Throw Rocks at the Boys Across the Brook and Get Fruit Chases.
Did it work?
For those of you who didn't hear, up until the age of 12, she played war games with other girls. That is, my understanding is unusual, cross-culturally. Yes.
I think that women just haven't been studied like men, because as an immigration attorney, I deal with these people from these Muslim countries. Where I really had my eyes opened was I had a young Muslim woman writing to an asylum interview with me. She was Palestinian back after the first Gulf War. And she started telling me about when Saddam Hussein bombed missiles at Tel Aviv. I mean, her eyes lit up, she became very animated. She had 2 young sons. I think if you look at the Iranian mothers who send their boys into landmines, it's the mothers who are inculcating these in their children. Same with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Her mother was the one. Her father was gone. Who did this to her?
No, that's the mothers instill, some of the ideology. But again, Ayaan Hirsi Ali's mother was not instilling, if I remember the book correctly, her taking acts of violence.
No, but she probably would have with her boys.
Well, maybe, but no. I would say we need more research. But the interviews, what I've presented today is based on hundreds and hundreds of interviews. I'm not presenting this. What I've done for you is synthesize enormous amounts of material that's out there, and I think is not paid attention to. I think yes, ma'am.
I just had one comment on women and violence. I think I agree it's not been studied in that much detail. In my own family, there's one gun owner, which is me, not my husband. And I think it's just a matter of opportunity, and I think it's a mistake to underestimate the potential violence in women. Just haven't had a chance to develop already.
The comment was that, for those who didn't hear, that underestimating women's potential for violence, she owns a gun, her husband doesn't. Maybe, but I'm a forensic psychiatrist. I spend a lot of my time, interviewing men who have killed, and it's rare that I interview a woman. And usually when they do, it's to protect family or to protect themselves. In other words, it's to protect life, whereas men, they do it for reasons of what I showed you. Let's see. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to make the point that I don't think it's a coincidence that many of these suicide bombers come from cultures that are very sexually segregated, and that if you have a sexually integrated society, both the men and the women are too busy doing other things to get violent.
Yeah. Sounds like everybody heard the comment. Again, I didn't have time today, but I have a quote. Syed Qutb has quotes about the fear of women. Okay, and as Christopher Hitchens said in his book, the problem is not, the virgins in paradise. It's that too many of these men are virgins. And the Madras schools, they're separated early on from women and from the modifying effect of women. And that there's frightening stuff in Qutb about women. And if you remember Muhammad Atta and his saying in his last will that no woman was to touch his body. And so there is, I think in this ideology, there is a fear or a problem with women, and how it fits into this, I think, needs more work.
I have just one more question, I think.
Yes, sir.
Isn't the psychology of male coalitional violence and how to improve that part of our military training or anybody else's military training?
The question isn't part of military training how to restrain coalitionary violence, or how to enhance it. Oh, that was my wish, how to restrain it. How to enhance it. Yeah, well, but that's basic military training, is bringing men together, making them feel like brothers, and enhancing the capacities for, you never leave a wounded comrade. The Marines talk about the brothers. I mean, all of military training is trying to create a group, a band of brothers. Absolutely. But at times it is necessary.
At least we don't do what the Spartans do. Well, the Spartans encouraged their armies to fight better together by basically forcing the homosexual relationships. That solves the fraternity problem and the band of brothers problem right there. Brilliant.
I think it's time for lunch. Thank you very much for your attention.
This has been a superb exhibition of the deployment of the wisdom and knowledge of a scientist and a doctor. A terrific delivery, and I must say, on behalf of RDFRS, I'm proud to have put on this.
Thank you. Listen. Thank you again. It doesn't get much better than being introduced by Richard Dawkins.